Turn your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 16. 1 Samuel chapter 16. I'm going to pick up where we left off in the last message and dealing with what do we do with kings. First message, we saw God put Saul in place as a king. But Saul decided that he was going to do things his way and not God's way. We ended with pointing out that it took 38 to 40 years before Saul was removed and David was placed. So now we're dealing with David. David knows he's going to be king. So we're going to say, what do you do with kings? Well, David, what are you going to do with the king? What are you going to do with the king knowing what God intends for you to be? What do you do when the authority is wrong? 1 Samuel again, 16, beginning at 14, it says, "But the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord troubled him." This is the response that God has to Saul because Saul has said, I'm going to do it my way. And an evil spirit has troubled him. Now, we're now really getting a picture of who Saul is. Saul is not one who is going to seek after God. Saul is not going to be one who is going to try to do what's right. We don't see Saul sitting there understanding what's happening and says, you know what, I did wrong, and God, forgive me. I'm repenting. I need to turn back to you. I need to understand you're in charge. Saul doesn't do this. And so an evil spirit comes on him. And Saul's servant said unto him, Behold now, an evil spirit from God troubleth thee. Let our Lord now command thy servants which are before thee to seek out a man who is a cunning player on the harp. And it shall come to pass when the evil spirit from God is upon thee, that he shall play with his hand, and thou shalt be well. And Saul said unto his servants, Provide me now a man that can play well, and bring him to me. Then answered one of the servants, said, Behold, I have seen the son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, that is cunning in playing, and mighty valiant man, and a man of war, a prudent in matters, a comely person, and the Lord is with him. Wherefore Saul sent messengers unto Jesse, and said, Send me David thy son, which is with the sheep. And Jesse took an ass laden with bread, and a bottle of wine, and a kid, and sent them by David his son to Saul. And David came to Saul, and stood before him. Now again, here's the picture. David knows he's going to be king. He knows Saul has been rejected. Saul has an evil spirit about him. What that means, the Bible doesn't really clearly say, but we kind of get an idea a little bit later when Saul decides to pick up a spear and throw it at David. I mean, whatever this evil spirit is, it's a spirit of destruction. It's a spirit of anger. It's a spirit of hatred. It's a spirit that drives him mad. And his advisors say, look, let's find you somebody so that when you get in one of these moods or emotions come on you, let's have some music played to calm your spirit. And someone says, hey, I know somebody, it's David. Boy, I've heard him. So they go and they say, David, here's your job. We're going to bring you to King Saul. And Saul gets a little angry sometimes, and he gets this evil spirit about him. And what we want you to do is we want you to calm him down. We want you to be that which keeps him from doing these evil things. So David comes to him and he stands before him. I don't know, just to be honest, if it's me, I'm sitting there going, what, you want me to help him? Look, let him be on his own. Because the sooner he's off the scene, the sooner I get to be on the scene. As soon as he gets knocked out of this throne, then it's mine. But notice what David says. He stood before him, and he loved him greatly. That doesn't sound like the typical response in dealing with a king who was evil. Well, let him revel in his own mess. Let what happens to him. David loved Saul. We get so many times wrapped up in our anger toward authorities in our lives, even when they do evil. And our response would be, let them have it. And David's response is, I love him. That's not typical. That's not normal. And he says he loved him greatly and he became his armor bearer. That's huge. Because the armor bearer's job is to make sure that the soldier's armor was completely intact so that no harm can come to him. David not only loved him, David's job was to make sure nobody hurt Saul. His job was to make sure nobody got to Saul. So many times we look at our authorities that are over us that do wrong. We're like, hey, step out of the way. If someone gets them, someone gets them. Good for them. But instead, David's response is, I am going to personally make sure that nothing happens to this king. Not a normal response. Not something that is typically done. So, verse 12, and Saul sent to Jesse, saying, let David, I pray thee, stand before me, for he hath found favor in my sight. And it came to pass, when the evil spirit from God was upon Saul, that David took a harp, played with his hands. So Saul was refreshed, and was well, and the evil spirit departed from him. What do we do with kings? What do we do with kings when they're in rebellion against God? Well, it seems to me the Bible is telling us we need to love them, and we need to protect them because it's God's authority he put here. But they're evil. God sets up kings. It's not our job to take down the authority. It's not our job to remove them. It's our job to say, God, what do you want me to do? And God says, you protect authority. What do you do when authority tries to kill you? Samuel chapter 18, verse 8, and Saul was very wroth. And the saying displeased him, and he said, they have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed to him thousands. What can he have more but the kingdom? Saul at this point started realizing, boy, the people love David more than they love me. I mean, what more can he be? He's going to end up having the kingdom. They all love him. They don't love me. And Saul gets angry. I'm the king. Who does he think he is? And Saul eyed David from that day forward. And it came to pass on the morrow that the evil spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied in the midst of his house. And David played with his hand, as his other times. And there was a javelin in Saul's hand. Saul cast the javelin, for he said, I will smite David to the wall with it. Well, now here's David. His job is to make sure Saul is protected. His job is to make sure Saul is soothed when these evil spirits come. He's doing everything he can to help Saul. And what's Saul's response? He picks up a javelin, he picks up a spear, and he throws it at David to try to kill him. So what should be our response? What do we do when this evil authority tries to kill us? Well, it says there in verse 11, something that sounds pretty smart, and David avoided out of his presence. David got out of the way. Now, what would be our response? He's trying to kill me. You try to kill me, I'm going to kill you first. I'm going to take you out first. And David's response was, I'm just going to get out of the way. I mean, that kind of sounds smart. You know, someone tries to throw a spear at you. Smart thing to do is get out of the way. He gets out of the way, and Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him and departed from Saul. Saul at that point knew, hey, look, if it was me, I wouldn't be doing what David did. I'd be attacking me. And he realized that there was something different about David. Well, that just intensified his anger. Therefore, Saul removed him from him and made him the captain over 1,000. And he went out and came before the people. He said, just get him out of here. I don't want him around me, because he realized, boy, David is responding totally different than I would respond. Verse 14, and David behaved himself wisely. David, in his response to a king that was trying to kill him, first got out of his way, second of all, responded wisely. What was that wise response? His wise response was, this is God's business as who's king, not mine. It's not my job to remove him from this position. So in verse 15 it says, wherefore when Saul saw that he behaved himself very wisely, he was afraid of him. He was afraid of David because David was doing exactly what David should have done. And that is, it's not me. I'm not going to take you out. I believe Saul was afraid of David because he realized David's not going to take me out. God is. Because God is seeing after David. Well, what else do we do? Well, a lot of things happen, and we find David back in the palace again. We find him back in this situation in which Saul is there, and Saul then begins to try to kill him again. And David says, look, I got to get out of here. I can't stay here. So now we're seeing that he flees. David leaves, and it says, and it came to pass in chapter 24, when Saul was returned from following the Philistines, there was told him, saying, behold, David is in the wilderness of En-gedi. David has fled. He's got out of there. He says, I can't be anywhere near him. And so we know this story. Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all of Israel and went to seek David and his men upon the rocks of the wild goats. And it came to the sheepcotes by the way, where was a cave. And Saul went in to cover his feet, and David and his men remained in the sides of the cave. And the men of David said unto him, behold, the day of which the Lord had said unto thee, behold, I will deliver thine enemy into thine hand, that thou mayest do to him as it shall seem good unto thee. We know the story here. Saul, he's in the cave. David's men are hiding in the dark, and David's men come to him and says, hey, look, there's Saul. This is the day that God was telling you about. He's going to deliver the enemies in the hand, and you can do whatever seems right into thee. A couple things with that statement. The statement was true that God had told him that. But the statement was given to David in dealing with God's enemy, not God's man. That statement, they said, oh yeah, see, he's your enemy. God's given him to you. You need to destroy him. That statement that was given to David was in dealing with God's enemies, not David's enemies. And so they looked at Saul, well, he's your enemy. And David, and we know the story, then David arose and he cut off the skirt of Saul's robe privately. He cut a piece of the robe off. And it came to pass that afterward that David's heart smote him because he had cut off Saul's skirt. Well, again, we know the story. We know that he felt bad about this, and he felt, well, why? Why did his heart smote him? Because he knew that what his men had told him to do, and used scripture verses, if you will, to give him justification to do what he did, he knew it wasn't right. He knew that was not what God meant by that. God did not mean that you go after Saul because, as we see, verse 6, and he said unto his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing unto the master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch forth mine hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord. He comes back to his men and he said, listen, that's not what that verse meant. That's not what that, when God told me that, that's not what it meant. It was wrong. This is God's man. This is God's anointed. It's not my job to touch him. This is not the enemy. And so many times we look at our leaders, our authorities, those people that have authority over us, and we sit there and going, they're evil, they're wrong, we need to do something about it. God says he'd give us victory over the enemy, and they're the enemy. And David's pointing out to them, they're not the enemy. Why are they not the enemy? Well, we're going to see that. We're going to see why it is they're not the enemy. So again, we know the story, and David also arose afterward, went out of the cave, and cried unto Saul, saying, my lord the king. And when Saul looked behind him, David stooped with his face to the earth and bowed himself. And David said to Saul, wherefore hearest thou men's words, saying, behold, David seeketh thy hurt? And he goes on and he tells him, look, I know this is what you're thinking, that I'm out to kill you. That's what all your advisors are saying. Hey, man, you got to kill David before he kills you. He said, look, I want you to understand, I'm not out to kill you. You're not my enemy. You're not the one. And so he says in verse 12, the Lord's judge between me and thee, and the Lord avenge me of thee, but mine hand shall not be upon thee. Look, you know as well as I know, God has told you you're not going to have this kingdom. But that's his job, not my job. It's God's job to deal with you, not me. And he says in verse 3, as saith the Proverbs of the ancient, wickedness proceedeth from the wicked, but my hand shall not be upon thee. David was pretty much saying here, look, I'm not going to deal with this. This is God's business. And anybody who goes after God's man and God's authority is wicked. He said, because that's not my job. So what do we do with kings? What do we do with kings when they're wrong? What do we do with kings when they try to kill you? Well, we see David's response is, you protect God's man, you protect God's authority, you love them, you don't go after them because it's God's job. So what do you do when that evil authority is now finally gone? Well, now we look in 2 Samuel chapter 1. I don't know about you, but again, just getting personal here, when that evil leader's gone, we have a tendency to rejoice. It's about time. Boy, have it been, they should have been gone a long time ago. They should never have been here in the first place. This is, and a rejoicing comes out. What do we do? Well, let's look at what David did, 2 Samuel chapter 1. Now it came to pass, after the death of Saul. Now, we see in the last chapter of 1 Samuel, we see the battle that's taken place, and we know at that point that Saul and Jonathan are dead. At this point, David doesn't know. David does not know how the battle went. David is not aware of what's taking place. So we come here in 2 Samuel chapter 1, verse 1. After the death of Saul, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Amalekites, he was fighting another battle with another part of the army in another region. And David abode 2 days in Ziklag. He was cleaning up the final of the battle. He was clearing some things out. And it came to pass on the third day that, behold, a man came out of the camp from Saul with his clothes rent. The earth was upon his head, so it was, when he came to David, and he fell down to the earth and did obeisance. And David said to him, from whence comest thou? And he said unto him, out of the camp of Israel am I escaped. And David said unto him, how went the matter? I pray thee, tell me. And he answered, that the people are fled from the battle, and many of the people also are fallen and dead. And Saul and Jonathan his son are dead also. So David is now hearing for the first time, Saul and Jonathan are dead. And David said unto the young man that told him, how knowest thou that Saul and Jonathan his son be dead? Are you telling me the truth? Do you know for sure? Do you absolutely know this is not just a rumor? And the young man that told him said, as I happened by chance upon the Mount Gilboa, behold, Saul leaned upon his spear, and lo, the chariots and horsemen followed hard after him. And when he looked behind him, he saw and called unto me, and I answered, here am I. And he said unto me, who art thou? And I answered him, I am an Amalekite. And he said unto me again, stand, I pray thee, upon me, and slay me, for anguish is upon me, because my life is yet whole in me. Here's the picture. At this point, he's telling the story, and Saul is wounded. And Saul sees this man, and he says to him, I am in pain. I'm almost to the point of death. Put me out of my misery. Finish the job. So I stood, in verse 10, it says, so I stood upon him and slew him, because I was sure that he could not live after that he was fallen. He said, I went ahead and did what he said. I went ahead and slew him because I didn't think he was going to survive this wound either. And I took the crown that was upon his head and the bracelet that was on his arm, and have brought them hither unto my Lord. Now, here's the picture. He's looking at Saul. Saul says, look, I'm not going to survive. He agrees with him. He slays him. But he takes the crown and he takes the emblems that represent this is the king, and he said, I brought them to you. Now, why would he bring them to David? He brought them to David because everybody knew. David is the one everybody loves. David's the one that's winning the victories. So who else is there going to be king? Now, our response would be, good, Saul's finally gone. That's right. Those are mine. That's what I've been waiting for. But what was David's response? Verse 11, then David took a hold of his clothes and rent them, and all the men that were with him, and they mourned, and they wept, and they fasted until even for Saul, for Jonathan his son, and for the people of the Lord, for the house of Israel, because they were fallen by the sword. David's response was, he was emotionally distraught because God's man is dead. He wasn't, yep, he's dead, I'm now in charge. Wasn't that. Because not only did David understand that it's not his job to take down the authority, it wasn't David's job to sit there and say, I'm now the new authority. I'm now the king. He responded in sorrow because at that moment David's sitting there going, who is the authority that God's going to use to protect us? Because that's what authorities are. Authorities in our lives are God-given to protect the righteous. If you study in the New Testament, he points out in the New Testament that God sets up these authorities so as to do the evil to those who would do evil to others. They are there for our good. When we look at authorities, we sit there and go, and all they are is to tell us, what we can do and can't do. God says, no, the authorities are there for your protection. For those who are to do what is right, the authorities are there for our protection. David understood this truth. He understood this principle. And with the authority gone, David's going, now where is our protection? If the government is no longer there, there's not someone there. David's concern was, God, we're right now without protection. What is our response when that evil leader who's tried to kill us is finally gone? We're excited. It's about time they're gone. What's David's response? God, we're in trouble. We don't have the authority that's there for our protection. What are we to do? And the people that are around him are sitting there going, wait a minute, but I thought you're supposed to be the king. David then, after that short time of mourning, after that, he then gets up, and David said to the young man that told him this story, whence art thou? In other words, who do you think you are? The guy's probably sitting there going, what? David comes and he said, well, I'm just a stranger. I'm an Amalekite. And David said to him, how wast thou not afraid to stretch forth thine hand and destroy God's anointed? He pulls him aside. He says, wait a minute, who do you think you are? Why do you think you have the authority to slay God's anointed? And David called one of the young men and said, go near, fall upon him, and smote him that he die. David says, kill this man. This is not how you handle God's authority. You don't do this. That's not your job. And David said unto him, thy blood be upon thy head, and thy mouth hath testified against thee, saying, I have slain the Lord's anointed. And David lamented with his lamentations over Saul and for Jonathan his son. David just simply went back and says, we're in trouble. He stopped long enough to realize, wait a minute, I just realized what you said. You took out God's anointed. Kill him. And comes back and he says, what are we to do? He then comes to verse 24. Says, daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet, and with other delights, who put on ornaments of gold upon your apparel. He says, how are the mighty fall in the midst of the battle? O Jonathan, thou wast slain in thy high places. I am distressed for thee, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant thou hast been unto me. Thy love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. How are the mighty fallen, the weapons of war perished? His final response was his mourning for Jonathan, because the succession of kings was, Saul's dead, Jonathan takes over. And once again, David's response goes, there's not even a succession of kings now. Not even Jonathan, whom I loved, who I would have been willing solely to submit myself to Jonathan's authority as king. He's gone now as well. What do we do with kings? What do we do with kings that try to kill us? What do we do with kings that try to kill us when they're gone? We come back to 1 Timothy chapter 2. I exhort therefore that first of all supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings and for all in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life, and all godliness and honesty. For this is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Savior, who will have all men to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. We need to submit to God-given biblical authority no matter what happens, because that makes all the difference in the world whether or not the gospel gets out. We're so worried about, boy, we just got to win the world, while we're destroying all the authorities around us. The home is falling apart. The authorities and the job site's falling apart. Our government's falling apart. Our churches are falling apart, and everybody's wondering why. Perhaps we should learn some things from David and find out what are we supposed to do with kings. It might make a difference in our lives.